You are watching a Socially Good Television special presentation.
The Summit County Suicide Prevention Coalition was founded in 2005. Although some of the faces over the years have changed, our commitment and passion to prevent suicides has remained strong. Our efforts are guided both by the makeup of our county and the realities of our lost data. In 2022, Summit County saw the highest rate of African American suicides we've seen since 2014, despite the fact that our overall suicide rate dropped. Last year, African American males were 1.5 times as likely as their Caucasian peers to die by suicide in Summit County. Similar increases in loss have been seen across other parts of the country and the state. We hope that tonight's presentation can serve as a starting point for conversation, a connection for supports, and ultimately a reduction in suicide loss for all of our communities moving forward. It is with great honor that I introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Josephine Ridley. Dr. Josephine Ridley received her PhD in clinical psychology from West Virginia University, completing her psychology internship at the Cleveland Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and has worked at several sites in the VA, including the Gambling Treatment Program, residential rehabilitation, and as program manager for a partial hospitalization program for individuals with severe mental illness. She currently serves as Assistant Chief of Psychology at the VA Northeast Ohio Healthcare System, Adjunct Associate Professor of Psychology at Case Western Reserve University, and is active in private practice where she works with adolescents, adults, and geriatric clients. She is Program Director for the Cleveland VA's Clinical Psychology Postdoctoral Residency, Founding Chair of the Cleveland VA's Psychology Service Diversity Committee, and co-coordinator of the Mentoring Subcommittee for the Association of VA Psychology Leaders, Psychologists of Color, and Allies Special Interest Group. She is also Vice President of the Association of Black Psychologists, Greater Cleveland Chapter. Dr. Ridley co-chairs the Cleveland VA Institutional Review Board and is co-editor of the International British Journal of Guidance and Counseling. She is a master trainer for Zero Suicide Institute's Assessing and Managing Suicide Risk Workshops and certified by the American Association of Suicidology as a psychological autopsy investigator. She was most recently appointed as co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Executive Leadership Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Josephine Ridley.
I want to thank all of you for coming out. You could have been spending your evening a million different ways, but you chose to come out to really look at suicide in BIPOC communities. And that is really, really special. And I think we need to start with just giving yourselves a round of applause for coming out. I'm serious. Most of us know that this is tough times. These are tough times we're living in, and it's not easy, it's not comfortable. And topics related to race are especially uncomfortable, wouldn't you agree? Yeah. They usually leave us feeling a little worried, a little concerned. So in the moment that we speak in terms of Black individuals or African Americans, we really get uncomfortable. Sometimes we can talk about other races, other ethnicities, and we're okay. But when we talk about Black, then we think something else is going to happen. At some point, racism is going to be called into question, and people get a little worried. So let me put you at ease right away and say, every single person is in here voluntarily because they care about people of color, okay? Every single one of you cares about people of color. That's why you're here. So if we start with that assumption, then we can relax just a little bit. But I just wanted to start with that little bit of a disclaimer first, that you're in here because you care about people of color, or you wouldn't be here, okay? You could have checked a box a lot of different ways. They're offering CEUs all kinds of ways. How many of you have heard of PESI, P-E-S-I? Yeah, they're always sending me flyers. So there were a million ways you could get your CEUs. So this is really special, and I just want to give you a heartfelt thank you for being here tonight. So here's my disclaimers. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm not making any money on anything. While suicide occurs across all populations and diverse groups, this presentation will focus primarily on ethnic and racial diversity with occasional reference to other diversity factors. Okay, is that okay? So I know that suicide affects all groups, but I don't have enough time to focus on disability groups or LGBTQ groups or any of those other groups. There's lots of groups to focus on. They can each have their own full day of training, and it still wouldn't be enough time to cover everything. So I don't need to give you guys this trigger warning. You knew what you were signing up for, but I find that sometimes people don't realize how sensitive the topic is for them. And I really believe that at this point right now, there's probably multiple people in the audience who've lost someone that they really care about, and they've lost them recently. I believe there's some providers here who may have lost clients recently. And sometimes we think, okay, I'm okay right now. I'll be okay going to this topic, going and hearing someone talk about suicide. I'll be okay. But you never know. So I really want to encourage you to take good care of yourselves. We have to practice what we preach as providers. We're always telling other people to engage in self-care. Let's do that too. You recognize these faces, right? Some pretty important and influential faces up there, right? These are the faces of suicide. Some of them are very recent, like Naomi Judd, right? She died in 2022. You know, what's interesting about suicide is that it doesn't really care about your economic standing, your race, your gender. It just really seems to affect people across the board. And when I look at all of these faces, what they had in common is that they were pretty successful in their careers, right? So sometimes we think, well, suicide might be related to psychosocial stressors like financial problems, if I just had enough money. These people, many of them had more than enough money, and they still died. These are also the faces of suicide. Now, I do this purposefully. I remember when I first became connected with the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation. It was before it was fully OSPF, and we were an advisory committee, and we were trying to stand it up. And I was a part of the committee that searched for its first CEO, and I helped to hire the first CEO, and I've been sticking around ever since. And I remember thinking about how when we would do conferences, there would be this quilt of faces, people who had died by suicide, and how powerful that quilt was with those faces, how it put a face to this really serious tragedy and made people see that this was about people. And so I always like to start with these faces because most of these faces are familiar to us, right? Many of these people were very, very young. So this is our BIPOC celebrity community. And this is not all of them who died by suicide in the last decade. This is not all of them by any long shot. This is some of them. In 2022, we saw some horrible losses. Regina King is a pretty famous actress, and she had a son whom she really adored. And her son killed himself. His name was Ian Alexander, and he was 26 years old. He died on January 21st. On January 30th, Chesley Christ died by suicide. And she was a famous broadcaster, correspondent for the Extra Show. She was at the height of her career when she died. She was a former Miss USA. And the most recent and most painful loss was Stephen Boss, better known as Twitch. Now, I love dance shows. I love those kinds of reality shows. I don't really watch the Real Housewives of Atlanta. I know most of you do, but I've never seen an episode. But I love Dancing with the Stars, and So You Think You Can Dance, and I watched Twitch, and, you know, seemingly he had everything. He had everything going for him. I scoured the internet trying to see, had he ever been in therapy? Had he ever been diagnosed? He'd never been diagnosed with any mental illness. However, there's a whole bunch of armchair diagnosing going on. And I heard this term that, and as a psychologist, I haven't really used or heard, functional depression. I was like, oh, okay, they're teaching me something new here. So there's new diagnosing going on because we are struggling to understand suicide. Suicide doesn't always make sense. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some statistical trends. I'm going to try my best to make statistics a little more interesting. And we're going to recognize some risk factors for suicidal behavior in BIPOC communities. And we're going to describe some strategies to reduce suicidal behavior and enhance protective factors. So why do we need to focus on BIPOC communities? Why do we need to do that? Because as Dan actually mentioned in the very beginning, suicide rates are increasing in diverse racial groups, right? And these rates may not even be accurate because some of them may be underrepresented. I was looking at one of the faces on the previous screen was of a British actress who died at 16. She was 16 years old, and initially she died by hanging, and the coroner changed the cause of death from suicide to death by misadventure because her family argued, and this was in the UK, in Great Britain, her family argued that she had a lot going on. She had just signed some new deals for some TV production work, for some TV shows. She had a whole bunch of wonderful stuff going on, and they said there's no way she would have killed herself on purpose. She was just mad and was fooling around, and it went too far. And so they actually put on the coroner's report, and that was recent. That was 2022. So it may be that some of the rates are not accurate. There may be some underrepresentation. There could be some incorrect classification. There could be some, of course, underreporting. One researcher noted that research infrequently includes reports on race and other factors. And what I've found is that a lot of well-meaning researchers and clinicians are thinking, we don't need to note race. And I bet if I ask for a show of hands, many of you have heard people say, part of the problem with race in our country is we keep talking about it too much. If we didn't talk about it, people would just go on about their business. The problem with that, and we're going to talk about a little bit later why that's problematic, but part of the problem with that is that it leads to ignoring some things that we could actually do something about. If we don't talk about it, then we can't do something about it. Does that make sense? And the statistics that we've noted and healthcare disparities, et cetera, actually tell a different story. They tell us that we have to talk about it and that these differences are real, they're really happening. Part of cultural humility means that we're going to acknowledge that it's impossible to adequately know about all cultures, but it's still important to pay attention. So what are some barriers that are possibly leading to the difficulty in addressing suicide rates in the Black community? There's so many cultural barriers. When we look at someone like Twitch, who may not have gone to get mental health help, he may not have gone to see a psychotherapist, could be because of cultural mistrust and a lack of faith in what we call majority culture, okay, predominantly white culture of the United States. So many people of color really have difficulty trusting, and they have difficulty trusting for a number of reasons. And many times people report, well, what about the Tuskegee experiments? And they go on to talk about some of those things. But, one of the things that we don't talk about goes all the way back to slavery, and that is, a lot of the things we know about obstetrics and gynecology came from research done on slave women without anesthesia. And part of the reason why in today's medical culture they believe that, a lot of physicians believe that African Americans or Black people had higher pain tolerance, needed lower pain meds, is because of that research going all the way back to slave plantations when they did surgeries, experimental surgeries, and to develop the procedures we have today. Many of the procedures we use in OB/GYN work came out of the research done on non-anesthetized African American women, enslaved women. So there's a lack of trust because of some of the things that are going all the way back to slavery and beyond. Sometimes what gets in the way is the demeanor, even of professionals. You know, in my early days of training, I remember, so I was not psychoanalytically trained. I'm trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist, but I remember the training where they would say you're supposed to be a blank slate. You're not supposed to show any emotion when you're working with your client. Well, that's problematic in the Black community. That's very problematic. So if you're trying to take a very aloof, matter-of-fact demeanor, you're going to lose people of color almost every time. So we talked a little bit about history of mistreatment, fear of being misjudged or judged, fear of prejudice. Often people are afraid to go and talk to providers because they think that that person's going to label me as crazy. They're going to not understand. They're not going to believe me when I say that I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. There's also this desire for natural methods and a rejection of things that seem artificial, like medication. Is this strong belief that God's going to heal them. There's a lack of faith if you get treated. That means you don't really trust God to heal you. There's a concern about feeling invalidated or disrespected by providers. Providers can engage in what we call microaggressions unintentionally. This is why it is so important that we start with this basic assumption that we all mean well. In fact, it was interesting, just earlier today, I attended a psychology service diversity grand rounds. And one of our former trainees who's now employed at our VA, she was speaking on implicit bias, and she did an amazing job. But she was, reminding us that every single human being carries implicit bias. We do. That's just the way we're wired. We have this inefficient way of organizing the world that we think is efficient. And we think it's efficient because it's pretty quick. And as a result, we can actually let some of our biases slip, and we can leave a person feeling disrespected or invalidated. Many cultures, particularly Asian cultures, really value privacy. And some young people will feel like, hey, therapists are too old to understand. They don't get my generation. And then finally, there's this fear of being seen as weak. There is a researcher by the name of Dr. Joy DeGruy, and she wrote this really amazing book. She's not a regular psychologist, clinical psychologist. She's a social psychologist and a researcher. She wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. I highly recommend it. That book really chronicles and does a really good job of connecting the dots of why African Americans experience this need to not be seen as weak. And often, and it kind of reminds me of the military culture, where if you have mental health issues, if you're having thoughts of suicide, if you're having depression or anxiety, it can be misconstrued as a sign of weakness. I've had many women who have come to see me in my private practice who've said, I don't want you to see me cry because I don't want you to think I'm weak. So we have in our culture something kind of embedded that makes us think that if you cry, then somehow you're weak. Or if you have a need for other people, somehow you're weak. So let's do this. Let's talk about disparity just a little bit. One of the things that Dan referenced was the declining rates of suicide, which is awesome, right? So we did note in our country, for the first time, a dip in suicide deaths back in 2019. That trend downward continued in 2020. And by the way, I was looking at suicide rates globally throughout this whole time. I was part of my research is on suicide. And so I do a lot of looking at suicide rates in other countries. I look at a lot of research that they've done in other countries. And what I noted was that globally, even during the pandemic, suicide rates declined overall. However, specific populations, they did not. So for example, Asian older adults, suicide rates did not decline. And in our country, certain populations, it did not decline. But when you look at these overall rates, you see for the first time in a long time in 2019, a nice trending downward. Now, recently, what I've most recently heard, and I don't have the graphs in this particular presentation because I just became aware, is that the numbers are starting to creep back up again across our country. Still, so that for, you know, we had a good run where everything was decreasing. In fact, you can see this in the veteran suicide deaths. So this goes to 2019, you see this dramatic, statistically significant drop occurring in 2019. And that had continued through 2020, 2021 for veterans. In fact, this graph, this little chart I put here because it was really, you know, we were saying for a long time that suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in our country. COVID knocked it out of the top 10. It's no longer the 10th leading cause of death in our country. Instead, now it's the 12th. And so you see some of the rates here. It starts with heart disease and then goes all the way down to kidney disease. But you can see COVID-19 wasn't on there for 2019, but it starts in 2020. So the majority of deaths in our country are from heart disease and cancer, and it used to be suicide was up in that top 10. If we look at suicide rates in our country, you can see where Ohio falls, right? I don't think here, it's 13.75. And you can see the higher numbers are really out here. So the darker the color, the higher the numbers of suicide deaths. Okay, West Virginia is standing out right here. So this is 2020 data. Okay. So as you look at this, one of the things we note right away is that those states where people are kind of spread apart, there are higher numbers of suicides. And in states or areas where it's pretty densely populated, you see fewer suicides. And that kind of makes sense. And as we talk about protective factors, most of you will already know social connectedness is an important factor, protective factor against suicide. And so the more densely populated, there is not only greater social connectedness or being able to reach people, but you've also got greater access to health care. I had the opportunity to go out to Colorado 3 years in a row to present the Assessing and Managing Suicide Risk Workshop, the Zero Suicide Institute workshop. And at that time, they were 5th in the country. Colorado was 5th in the country for suicide deaths. But what was amazing, it was just beautiful out there, but they said it would take an hour to get to the nearest hospital. And often when clients or patients needed to be hospitalized, they would have to drive a very long distance, and when they would get there, there would be no beds. And people would just have to stay in emergency room chairs overnight, people who were at risk for suicide. So this is something to keep in mind as we think about BIPOC populations as well. Because one of the things we know is that economic disparity also plays a factor, and that can, you know, who gets treated and who does not. So these stats are from showing from 2019 and 2018, showing that first initial trend downward in suicide deaths. So this is still consistent. The highest suicide rates are in Wyoming, and the lowest are in New Jersey, New York, and of course DC has the absolute lowest. In 2020, there were roughly 46,000 suicide deaths, but here's the thing, we know that's not accurate, right? We all know that. We can't be accurate. So if we think about opiate overdoses, it's hard to tell whether they were intentional or accidental. So we know these numbers are not accurate, but it's important for us to see this too. And we were so long saying it was a 10th leading cause that it's going to be hard to get used to saying a different number. So one of the things, even though we were seeing this downward trend for the population overall, I mentioned that there were specific populations, pockets of our population where we didn't see the downward trend. Instead, we saw an increase. So in 2019, there was a bump up For African American men, 1.7% increase. For Asian and Pacific Islanders, 2.8% increase, right? And here's another slide that kind of demonstrates for us for veterans. If you notice, so the solid bar at the top are for white veterans. You see that little downward trend at the very end in 2019. But if you look at Black or African American veterans, they're the bottom line there, the dark bottom line. There was a slight trending upward or kind of moving in the upward direction in 2019. You also see an upward tick for Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders as well. For American Indian and Alaskan Native veterans, you saw a little downward trend. We saw headlines that were pretty startling. More young children are killing themselves. Black youth suicide rates rising, defying historic trends. Suicide rates rise in a generation of Black youth. Suicides by drug overdose increased among young people, elderly people, and Black women. So there were specific pockets of our population where we saw these increases. This is a chart that is looking at 2019 and 2020, and this is for males, and this is by race. And you can see at the bottom, it outlines, it starts with white males, then Black and Asian American, Alaskan, and American Indian, and Hispanic. Now, note the little downward trend here with white males, and then an upward increase with Black, a little bit down for Asian males, but the increase for American Indian and Alaska Natives, and an increase for Hispanic. This is for women. So historically, and still today, African American women have the lowest rates of suicide. So there was this myth that went around in the Black community and in the community in general, just like there was a myth that Black people didn't, we had a higher pain threshold. We didn't feel pain the same way. So that was a myth, but there was also this myth that suicides didn't occur. So here's the thing that people don't know is that usually when suicide deaths are occurring, it's because a person has access to a pretty lethal mean. And Black women aren't typically carrying around guns, and they also historically had more social connectedness when they were greater ties to the church and to their community. What we're noting now is that younger generations are moving away from the church. There's less of that social connectedness and community ties. And as a result, we're seeing, for the first time in history, a slow increase in suicide deaths among African American women. In a moment, I'm going to talk about some more statistics on that in just a moment. There was a report produced in October of 2020. It was called African American Youth Suicide Report to Congress. So Congress requested the Department of Health and Human Services to submit this report because they wanted to know why Black children aged 5 to 12 were dying by suicide at nearly twice the rates of their white counterparts. And that's part of what we're going to look at today. That's what we want to examine as well. So the slide you're looking at right now is from the National Vital Statistics System. So this is the United States, nationwide. And this is looking at Black and white youth, different ages, right, from 1999 to 2018. Now I want you to look at some of these increases. So the very top line, consistently white individuals, so that's 15 to 17-year-olds. They're at the highest numbers, okay? Now, if you look at, so the next blue line down with the little diamond shape is Black individuals, 15 to 17. But if you look in the middle, 12 to 14-year-olds, look at the difference in 12 to 14-year-olds. You're going to see Black individuals, 12 to 14, the numbers are trending upward, right? Now, look at Black individuals, 5 to 11. That's the bottom line along with white individuals' bottom line. So Black individuals, even though they are fewer in numbers, Black children, their numbers had started to trend upward even as the white 5 to 11-year-olds numbers were trending down. And I just want to thank Leslie Stoyer, who's the executive director of NAMI, for sending me her 2022 suicide fact sheet. What you see here, Summit County, it was interesting to me that African American males outnumbered white males in 2020 for suicide deaths. Now, when you see suicide rates per 100,000, that is to make numbers more comparable. So when you have lower numbers of individuals, if you go by the raw numbers, it doesn't tell the full story, right? So that's why we compare rates based on 100,000. If you look at 2022, you still see, even though the numbers have gone down, you still see a higher number for African American males. And this is why Summit County Suicide Prevention Coalition, NAMI, and the Adam Board are all paying attention, and I just want to commend them for even allowing us to use the term Black in the title of our presentation. I have actually been told by different organizers when they've invited me to speak on diversity issues, they've actually asked me to leave the title Black out of the title. Don't use the term Black, just say communities of color or say diverse groups, because they want more people to come. So it's, I just want to commend them for being, very overt about the fact that they want to reduce suicide deaths in BIPOC communities. So this is coming from the dashboard, from the Adam board, and this dashboard is amazing. So these are the rates for Summit County, rates per 100,000, and this particular slide is for African American suicide deaths. So the blue bars are males, the green bars are women, okay? And then the yellow line is the total combined. And you can see the little upward trends, right? If you look at women, which they're the green bar, you can see from 2020 to 2021 and to 2022 an increase for women, African American women. So just noting that locally, same thing is happening that is happening nationally. This is a really interesting slide because it's a nice graphic of demonstrating the downward trend overall in suicide deaths for Caucasians. You take a look at that. And you can also note, if you look at this, the lower right-hand side, this is for Caucasian suicide death rates per 100,000. The green, again, represents women, and the blue, men. Look at that from 2021 to 2022. The rate went from 6.0 to 8.3 for women. So there was a little bit of a trending up there. Now, obviously, these numbers may not be statistically significant, but they're still showing us interesting trends. And it's really kind of amazing to see the upward trends for African Americans and the downward trends for white Americans. So at one point, suicide was the 16th leading cause of death for African Americans of all ages, and the third leading cause for 15 to 24-year-olds. And the fourth for Black females in that age group. Now, second leading cause. The suicide rate for African American children doubled between 1993 and 2012. One of the things that I like to do is there's a whole body of research and even a website that looks at trends in the media and how the media's portrayal of suicide and what's happening in the news correlates with suicide deaths. So I like to look at that and I like to compare. So for example, one of the most noticeable suicide trends in our country occurred during the Great Depression, right? Where people were jumping out of buildings, right? And most of those people were white males when when there was a crash, when the Great Depression occurred. So I like to look at those kinds of trends. During World War II, suicide rates decreased. We were pulling together against a common enemy. So at times when we're pulling together, we see rates decrease. So between 93 and 2012, thinking about what might have happened, that might have increased, right? And so the rate for African American children doubled, while the rate for white children was decreasing during that period. So this is not new. And because the Black community is disproportionately young, this is definitely affecting even more. So this slide is a little bit busy, but I have it up there because I wanted you to see some of the trends. In 81 to 94, we saw a 78% increase. Is that because people were reporting more? Maybe. In that same period, 15 to 24-year-olds, there was an 83% increase. For 15 to 24-year-old females, there was a 10% increase. And from 94 to 2004, you saw this nice decrease. And then it kind of bumped back up. Now look at this. For African American children, 5 to 11, what we've been getting alarmed about in the news has been going on before. This is not new. So we have to think about what is happening in our world that may be affecting them, and that's what we're going to talk about. So one of the most important studies that kind of really sparked that report to Congress was a study by Bridge and colleagues. And this study looked at the suicide rates for 5 to 12-year-old African American boys and girls. And they noticed that it was 2 times higher for Black children compared to white children. And they looked at the age group 12 to 14, and they looked at the age group 5 to 11, and they found some differences. So one of the differences was that for the 5 to 11-year-olds, they were more commonly male, and they were more likely to die by hanging or strangulation, suffocation. They were also more likely to have experienced a relationship problem with a family member or friend than the 12 to 14-year-olds. They were less likely to have had a problem with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or leave a suicide note. That makes sense, because some 5-year-olds can barely write, right? So it makes sense that they're less likely to leave a suicide note, less likely to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And here's the thing for diagnosis. This was the most shocking part. They were more likely to carry a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD than depression compared to those 12 to 14-year-olds. So the 12 to 14-year-olds were more likely to carry a diagnosis of depression. So what does that tell you about your practice? If you've got young African American or other children of color in your practice and they have ADD or ADHD, this is something that means you need to be even more vigilant, right? We can also think about how these factors might have affected them to increase their risk for suicide. What is it about those diagnoses? Well, we know with ADD and ADHD, impulsivity and poor problem solving. That should give you some ideas right away. How do we teach problem solving? How do we teach self-control? How do we teach staying in the moment, but also being planful, recognizing that problems are temporary? For relationship problems, this means that family is really important. And this is my moment to kind of do my little soapbox thing. And this is my moment where I might not be as popular, but I'm going to say this anyway. So here's the thing. In our popular culture, it is quite common to say if somebody makes you uncomfortable, they're probably toxic and you need to get away from them. What I know about parenting and about having been a former child is that there are going to be uncomfortable moments in relationships, right? Even the best of relationships have discomfort. And whenever we're not having things go smoothly or go the way we want, then it's going to be uncomfortable. So we might need to think about our definition of toxic relationships. We also need to think more broadly about cultures. That in some cultures, if they've been raised to value family and connectedness, and now as their therapist, you're seeing a 16-year-old who's been raised in a Black family all her life, and you're telling her, you know, if your parent isn't respecting you, you need to stand your ground, and, you know, at some point, you know, you got to get away from that toxic parenting. So I'm not talking about times when there's physical abuse. I'm not talking about times when there was very much overt abuse. but times when people are saying or calling things toxic parenting. So remember when I said the lowest suicide rates typically were African American women? Well, in the Black community, they also overall, including men, used to have the lower rates. But as the social connectedness that was often occurring through the church has kind of gone away, we're seeing rises in suicide rates as the community is more and more split and divided, as families are more and more split and divided. So all through the literature that I've examined, social connectedness remains a protective factor. So be very culturally sensitive and culturally humble. Don't go for the immediate reaction of, if you're seeing a young adult saying, hey, well, you just need to disconnect from your toxic family. Think about how you can mend relationships. In fact, I think a lot more of our work needs to be towards mending relationships, bringing people together. I told you it wouldn't make me popular to say that. I gave you a warning. All right. Again, here's some more information. And when they compared African American youth to their white peers, what they found in that report to Congress is that there was usually a crisis preceding 2 weeks right before the suicide death. They had a family relationship problem. There was an argument or conflict. There were some history of suicide attempts, more likely for Black youth compared to their white peers. There were also other suicide circumstances, including housing instability, history of non-suicidal self-injury, self-harm, or history of traumatic brain injury. Now, a lower proportion of Black youth had a known mental health problem, and a lower proportion had a current depressed mood or a history of thoughts or plans. Now, there was a marginally higher proportion of Black youth suicide decedents who had a history of suicide attempts. A past or current treatment for mental illness was also lower occurring in Black youth compared to white youth. Let's talk about Hispanic Americans. So the rate for all ages, and this particular slide is showing data from SPRC, and so this data might be from 2019. So the rate at that time was 5.09 per 100,000. It was 11th ranked across that age group. And more of the Hispanic youth reported having made a suicide attempt than the general population. And studies have shown that Hispanics born in the United States have higher rates of mental illness than those immigrating. Some risk factors. Research has shown that less than 1 in 11 with mental illness has had a contact with a mental health provider. Some of that is because of language barriers, right? Some of it is about access to health care, maybe not having insurance, maybe some being undocumented, some of them adapting to a new culture. Protective factors, again, social support. This is found almost all the time when they're looking across the board. Extended families, any religious belief that suicide is a sin, and then a fatalistic life orientation, meaning that struggle is a part of life. Just accept that. That's a protective factor in Hispanic communities. For Asian and Pacific Islanders, this is the rates for that particular population, and I'm going to scoot through just a little bit. Risk factors, stigma related to mental illness. Again, in this community, privacy is very important, and they do not want to bring shame to the family. There's a very low expectation about the effectiveness of services, and there's a strong belief that physical problems cause emotional problems. I happen to agree to some extent, because sometimes when we forget that even our emotions, our cognitions, when we're thinking, when we're talking, there are physical changes happening in our brain. And I think that you cannot separate the mind from the body. So in some ways they're right, but they think that going to a talk therapist won't help the body. But the truth is, as we talk to each other, there are changes happening in our brain that do cause physical changes that can be helpful. There's difficulty adapting to the culture, there's isolation, all of those factors. Protective factors also go back to religion. And any kind of ideology that lowers risk due to an emphasis on interconnectedness and a focus on the group over the individual. For American Indian and Alaskan Natives, this is the #1 cause of death across all ages. And for 10 to 34-year-olds, suicide was the 2nd leading cause of death. I'm sorry, suicide was the 8th leading cause across all ages, but when you drill down to 10 to 34-year-olds, it's the 2nd leading cause. Risk factors, again, goes to access to mental health services, and it's not just access to mental health services. We want access to good mental health services like what you guys offer. Weakened parental influence and tribal unity is a risk factor. Poverty, poor educational achievement, and substandard housing. Protective factors include discussion of problems with their families, tribal unity and spiritual orientation, and emotional health. Even the Surgeon General recommended that mental health providers become more culturally aware and move towards using more traditional methods of healing, incorporating traditional healers more in our practices, reaching out and partnering. There's a lot of risk factors here. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret. There have been some amazing researchers who've taken a look at all of the studies examining risk factors for suicide. Do you know there are thousands of risk factors that have been identified for suicide? Thousands. So typically the list you see are the most common across populations, but there are thousands. So risk factors have somewhat of a limited utility. In fact, they're not very good at predicting who will die by suicide. They often lead to false positives and false negatives. They've done studies with thousands of individuals who were hospitalized because of a suicide attempt or suicidal thinking, and they followed them over the course of many years, and they had used their risk factors to try to decide who would die and who would not, and the results were abysmal. They were terrible. So risk factors aren't really good at predicting, helping us to predict, but what they are good at is helping us to identify relationships. So we know these factors have some relationship with suicide. So that we do need to be aware of those risk factors and try to mitigate them as best we can. All the risk factors, one that I really want to point out here that has been identified as a risk factor for suicide in African Americans is racism and discrimination. For African American youth, interpersonal problems and life stressors, problems at school. So we come up with all of these, but I can tell you that recently, actually I just came back from Denver in November. I did a 2-day workshop for a collaborative. And the collaborative was called a BIPOC collaborative. And it was really fascinating to meet the individuals a part of that collaborative. But one of the things that I heard them say, and I've heard this before from audiences, is that, and I can understand why they feel this way, because when you look at people like Twitch, who seemingly, he had a beautiful wife, 3 beautiful children. A few weeks before he died, he was doing a TikTok dance, spontaneously with his wife, looked really happy, always smiling. People often say, you just never know. You just never know. And so when we look at these risk factors, we could say, okay, well, we've got people with all of these risk factors who may never attempt, and then there are people with none of these risk factors who do. And so it can lead people to feeling kind of helpless. But what we're going to do is we're going to do just like the cardiology physicians and our primary care physicians. We're going to treat suicide like a public health problem in the same way we treat heart disease like a public health problem, right? So with heart disease, we look at risk factors. What's the risk factor for a heart attack? Exactly. Right. So obesity, sedentary life, high blood pressure, lack of exercise, poor diet. We can rattle off those risk factors, can't we? Same as suicide. We're going to rattle off those risk factors. What do we do when we go see our primary care docs? They treat us all the same, right? They approach us all in the same way. They ask about our behaviors, our diet, our exercise, right? They look at our blood pressure. They try to lower the blood pressure with medicine. They try to lower our cholesterol, right? So they are approaching it by looking at those risk factors and trying to mitigate them, right? And what are the protective factors against heart attack? Exercise, good diet, right? Low stress, get enough sleep, right? We can rattle those off. Now, if you go to the doctor, if you go to the emergency room and you say, I've got 20 risk factors for heart attack, will they hospitalize you? They want to know what are the warning signs you're having a heart attack. That's what will get you hospitalized. So in suicide, we look at warning signs, right? And you guys all know those. You can access warning signs anywhere. So that's the difference between warning signs and risk factors. We try to reduce the risk factors while shoring up the protective factors, just like in the heart literature, in the heart world, right? Whether our heart doctors or primary care doctors. We're doing the best we can by approaching those risk factors and trying to reduce them. That makes sense, right? But we also know it's possible to not have any of those risk factors and still die by suicide. Just like it's possible to have none of the risk factors for a heart attack and still have one. How many of you are familiar with Bob Harper from The Biggest Loser, right? He's a personal trainer, right? He had all the protective factors. He was exercising. He had a heart-healthy diet, right? He was training others, helping them to lose weight. He had a heart attack, right? So in the same way, we cannot solely rely on risk factors, but we do want to pay attention to warning signs. Now, what I kept hearing people say was, well, that person showed no warning signs at all. Sometimes they're subtle, okay? Sometimes the warning signs are very subtle. But it also goes back to, in the Black community, and often people hate when you make reference to slavery, but there's a whole body of research looking at transgenerational trauma, right? Intergenerational trauma was really looked at a lot with Holocaust survivors and their offspring. And they found genetic changes occurred in the offspring as a result of trauma that the parents or the ancestors had. Does that make sense? So we know that slavery was a really traumatic time. And so there are some traumatic or intergenerational trauma that is being translated or passed on through generations. So it can affect them. One of the things we know about slavery is that if you did not want your husband or your children sold off, they all had to look healthy. Because if they were unhealthy or weak, they might get sold off. Or they might get beaten by the master. So you can never let them see you sweat, meaning you can never look weak. Okay? In the Black community now, you see that same kind of machismo, bravado, where you're not allowed to look weak because, again, it means something bad would happen to you. And so when I think about someone like Twitch, I think about how he couldn't let them see his heartache. He couldn't let them see the pain he was in. So even as you look at these risk factors for African American youth, you can see how tied into pain each of those are. And when you believe that there is no way out to get out of your pain, then you think about suicide as the way out. What we want to do as providers is teach each of our clients that there's another way to end the pain, that there isn't just one way to end the pain. There are other ways. If you look at the drug addiction rates in our country, right? If you look at the rates of substance use disorders in our country, we know that people are trying to escape pain. So we are trying to teach people how to move through pain, how to overcome pain in other ways. And often if you present to your clients that, one of the things I like to do is to say to my clients, I'm wondering if we could find a way to end some of this pain that you're in. Maybe it's not necessary for you to end your life. And I've seen the light bulb go off in my clients of color and in my white clients. I've seen the light bulb because they feel like somebody gets how much pain they're in, number one, but that person also has hope that that pain can be eliminated or decreased. And I'm giving them the idea that there are other ways for that to happen. And that's what I want you to take away too, that this really is a part of your movement of your clients away from suicide. There are multiple theories that address suicide, look at the etiology. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just listed them here, some of them. Edwin Schneidman is considered the father of suicidology. In fact, he was the one who coined the phrase suicidology. He's the person who's one of the founders of the American Association of Suicidology. He had all kinds of terms he came up with. But one of the terms he came up with that I think is worth noting, he came up with this term called psych-ache. He wanted a term that would describe the mental anguish and pain that people who are experiencing suicidality, that they're experiencing in that moment. He wanted us to know the pain was overarching. It was so all-encompassing that it makes the person want it to end right then. That's what's happening. When your loved one dies by suicide, what has happened is they have felt encompassed by that pain in that moment. And so if we can focus on helping people to move away from the pain and to see that that pain is going to be temporary, then we can save some lives. So I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm going to keep moving. So racism as a factor for why suicides are occurring in BIPOC communities. Let's focus on African American community for just a moment. These are some horrific images. This one with the person with the face beat up, maybe some of you will recognize Rodney King. So I remember what was interesting, and I'm just sharing all kind of personal things, but when I was teaching at Baldwin Wallace College was when Rodney King was beaten. And one of the things that stood out to me, I had a class it was an all-white class. There were no people of color in it. I was teaching this class, and it was a developmental psych class, and we were looking at morality development. And I was talking to them about this event that had happened in the news, and it was so interesting how the majority of the class was saying he had it coming. When he was unarmed, and he was pretty much beaten, and kicked, and we all saw it happening in real time. The interesting thing about George Floyd's murder is that he wasn't the first person to be murdered. It had been going on over the course of years, but we watched it happen. We watched it in real time. Many of us were working from home. Many of us were, able to see it. Well, guess who else is seeing it? 5 to 12-year-olds. Little black children are seeing a world that's telling them that they may be less than, that they may not be as important. That's what they're seeing. That's painful. They're also living and seeing communities where there is lack, where there is disparity. And they're seeing all of those things. Let's talk about some of the research. So microaggressions and racism have been examined quite a bit. So what is a microaggression? A microaggression is an event. It could be a verbal, it could be behavioral, it could be anything that actually is done in a way that negates the importance of the other person. It is a slight against another group of individuals or one individual. The term micro refers to being on an individual person-to-person level. Sometimes when people hear the term microaggression, they think you're minimizing its impact or its importance. But really what it's talking about is person-to-person. Macroaggressions happen on a societal level, like building a wall. That's a macroaggression. Taking people's land, macroaggressions. But saying a comment like, oh, you're very articulate, being surprised that someone is articulate. Or saying, where are you from, really? That's an example of a microaggression. So one study that was conducted by the American Psychological Association found that daily discrimination experienced by people of color had a profound impact on stress levels. And it not only contributed to poorer physical health, but mental health as well. Microaggressions also include denying or negating racialized experiences, and that can also result in lower emotional well-being, increased depression, being on a hostile or invalidating campus. It can impede learning and problem solving and impair employee performance, and of course negatively affect physical well-being. Other research has found that Racial trauma and microaggressions can lead to paranoia, avoidance of dominant groups, somatic complaints, and excessive worries about loved ones. I lead a race-based stress and trauma group, actually race-based stress, trauma, and resilience group at the VA, and one of the things that I've seen is such huge anger from our veterans of color recently. And in this group, as we are teaching them coping skills, often it's hard to let go of their anger. There's a struggle, an internal struggle, and we've seen some amazing stuff happen. Generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, all kinds of conditions can result from racism. So if we think about these conditions, often they have a relationship to suicide, right? Sleep in and of itself, insomnia is strongly correlated with suicide. That's why we are really pushing that everyone take a public health approach to suicide, not treat it like it's a mental health issue. It's not just about mental health, right? In fact, the majority of people who die by suicide have not seen their mental health provider in the last 30 days. They've seen their medical provider in the last 30 days. And sleep is a significant risk factor for suicide, sleep difficulties, insomnia. Pain is also a major risk factor for suicide. So all of these that we see listed here can increase a person's risk for suicide. Now, I've got on the slide now 2 really important organizations that issued apologies. These organizations are recognizing the impact of racism on the mental health of people of color. So the American Psychiatric Association was the first to issue an apology. And their apology, you can see the date there, January 2021. Later on that year, in October of 2021, American Psychological Association issued an apology. There were other organizations as well. The American Academy of Pediatrics, they put out an impact statement, a policy statement, looking at the impact of racism on child and adolescent health. And they said in their statement, racism is a core social determinant of health that is a driver of health inequities. Look at the date on theirs, August 2019. The impact of racism has been linked to birth disparities and mental health problems in children and adolescents. Who have we been talking about? 5 to 12-year-olds, right? To identify, address, and manage the impacts of racism on child health, it's critical that pediatricians understand 3 key levels through which racism operates: institutional, personally mediated, meaning implicit and explicit bias, and internalized. They went on to say that internalized negative stereotypes related to race can unconsciously erode self-perception and capacity, and may later play out in the form of stereotype threat or the fear of confirming a negative stereotype of one's race, which can undermine academic and vocational attainment. It's almost like they get caught in a vicious cycle. We know that chronic racial stress leads to medical problems, right? That adverse childhood experiences or events can lead to health problems. Look at that. Suicide attempts is listed right up there with the impact that ACEs can have on health. The more ACEs, the higher the risk. So the higher the risk for suicide as well. The institution that was formerly called the Institute of Medicine, they're now called, and I can't remember what they're now called, but they produced a report called Unequal Treatment, and they found that even when you controlled for barriers such as insurance and family income, people of color received worse health care than non-people of color, that both explicit and implicit bias played potential roles. The U.S. Surgeon General also said that the mental health needs of people of color continue to be unmet. They suggested that individual and institutional racism continues to affect the quality of life. And because of racism, the health status for persons of color are resulting in shorter lifespans. Now, this is a busy slide, and I don't expect you to be able to see this, but I'm going to tell you what this is. This was a study that was done in Maryland. And what they did something pretty interesting. They looked at the onset of COVID in Maryland, and they compared it to suicide deaths. Now, where you see the little red dot that's moving, that line represents white individuals dying by suicide, okay? The suicide rates went down during the COVID crisis for white individuals. Look at what it did for black individuals. But also, there was a disproportionate amount of deaths, COVID deaths, for black individuals in Maryland. So this is pretty telling as well. One of the first times that we started to pay attention to those health disparities was in relation to what happened in Maryland. I'm going to keep going. There have been multiple studies looking at racial discrimination and risk for death. This is just one study that I highlighted. The research has shown consistently that alienation and interpersonal rejection can fuel suicide vulnerability. This study found evidence of direct and indirect effects of racial discrimination on death ideation, so thinking about death or suicide. Now, the relationship between racial discrimination and death wasn't even mediated by depressive symptoms, so that meant depression had nothing to do with it, okay? Anxiety was predictive of suicide or death ideation after controlling for stressful life events and symptoms of depression. So when we look at racism and suicide risk, I want you to consider structural racism is elevating suicide risk in the community. Intersectionality is important for us to pay attention to because it can lead to an accumulative effect on suicide risk that might explain why the numbers are starting to trend up in the African American women. And that in Latinx and African American sexual minority youth, their suicide rates are 2 to 7 times higher than heterosexual youth. So what is the historical impact of racism? If you think about removal of American Indians from ancestral lands via the Removal Act of 1830, if you think about Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, if you think about the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942 to 1946, slavery of African Americans 1619 through 1863 or 1865, and the ongoing oppression of African Americans through systemic racism, black codes, voting laws, sharecropping, Jim Crow, redlining, and incarceration. All of those historic factors are playing a role in what we see today. Gendered racism is about the intersectionality that people are experiencing. So intersectionality for African American women, where they're located at the intersection of disadvantaged gender, disadvantaged race, and disadvantaged class status. This is a direct quote from an article by Perry and colleagues. The confluence of negative representations of African American womanhood and identity create a system of oppression that works to silence black women, making them vulnerable to sexual violence, discrimination, and sexism in ways that white women may not be. For African American women, racism is compounded by a longstanding gender ideology that devalues women, resulting in an intersectional form of oppression that has been termed both racialized sexism and gendered racism. African American women report frequent experiences of racism and sexism, engage in multiple strategies to focus on and cope with both simultaneously, and this often results in high levels of stress, maladaptive behaviors, and depression. They have higher rates of suicide attempts. So while their deaths are lower compared to African American men, their attempts are much higher. So African American women, 5.0% compared to 2.7% of men. Higher rates of suicidal thoughts as well. The study by Perry in 2012 demonstrated the impact of gendered racism. So higher levels of gendered racism were associated with significant increase in the odds of an African American woman reporting suicidal thoughts. When they had a history of mental illness, they were 4 times more likely to experience suicidal thoughts. And if they had high levels of well-being, they were much less likely to experience suicidal thoughts. Again, communication is not always made to professionals. Often it's made to family members, right? This is the percentage of individuals, black and white, who did not seek or receive any psychiatric services in the year prior to having a suicide attempt or thoughts. Look at it for blacks. Almost 60% had had thoughts but did not seek psych services. This was in 2000. And suicide attempts, 57.8% compared to 24.1% for whites. Why are they reluctant to disclose? Some of it has to do with stigma, not wanting to be hospitalized, right? Stigma is a pretty good factor. There's this strong black woman myth. So stigma in the community has been demonstrated in research frequently. Rita Walker is one of my favorite authors and researchers. She's done quite a bit of work looking at suicide in the black community. And what she's found consistently is the culturative stress, not just in the black community, but in other communities of color, often leads to suicide, greater suicide risk. So let's move towards healing. Common protective factors, no matter what race or gender or population, include effective mental health care, connectedness, and contact with caregivers and problem-solving skills. For African Americans in particular, the cultural factors are really key and important. Religious involvement that really involves reduced risk of suicide attempts. So spirituality is important. Now, does that mean that suicides don't occur in black churches? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Again, it's about the connectedness and the ability to be able to voice the pain. Time orientation, racial pride, those things help to moderate suicide risk. And family cohesion. Africanistic perspective of collectivism is also very important. So what is meant by a black identity? That means they are pro-black, they have positive internalization of being black, and it's characterized by pride and self-acceptance. Social and emotional support is extremely important. Family support, peer support, community connectedness have been shown to help protect black adolescents from suicidal behavior. Similarly, positive interactions and social and family support have been important. More protective factors include these indirect protective factors, like reasons for living, perceived supportive behaviors from family, and again, Afrocentric worldview. So what is an Afrocentric worldview? It's a construct that embodies values, interests, and perspectives that originated from Africa, and they're composed of several dimensions: spirituality, collectivism, time orientation, orality, sensitivity to affect and emotional cues. Again, why you can't be the blank slate when you are working with African Americans. You must be authentic, you must be genuine, and you must have an emotional response as well. Verve, rhythm, balance, harmony with nature, all are part of the Afrocentric worldview that reduces suicide risk. So cultural humility in suicide prevention means that we need to deliver care that effectively meets social, cultural, linguistic needs of diverse clients. It recognizes that the white or majority background has been the default normal, but that we need to move away from that being the default normal. Responsibility to educate ourselves on different backgrounds and cultural perspectives. That goes for each of us. Doesn't matter whether you're a person of color or not, you need to be aware of different backgrounds and cultural perspectives. So a cultural competence framework versus cultural humility, it means that we recognize intersectionality of multiple cultural identities held by individuals, right? Instead of just focusing on discrete groups. This next slide actually shows a little bit of the process moving towards cultural humility. It means identifying and acknowledging these differences. These are some empirically supported interventions that are effective in BIPOC communities as well as the general population, but because there's less access to these, and the providers themselves need more cultural humility and more cultural training, then they don't often have access to these. This is pretty much the end of my presentation. I wanted to present these particular apps, as we think about young people, the PTSD Coach has a safety planning app directly in it. Here are some organizations and resources that support BIPOC care. And while suicide rates have been trending down for the first time in 20 years, rates have been climbing in the Black community. There are many risk factors that we can consider. Protective factors against suicide rest clearly in African principles of connectedness and collectivism. Thank you guys for having me. Yeah.